Okay, the first thing though, before we even get into this, I want to talk about that test from last week. I did post those scores last Thursday, and I know we talked a little bit about it then, but I've made it accessible to you today and tomorrow if you'd like to take a look at what you did and look at how you responded and look at what the correct answer was. Remember, the way I designed that test was there were 20 multiple choice questions going across 5 chapters. So I created like a dozen questions for each chapter, and Canvas randomly selected 4 of them for each of you. So everybody had a slightly different version of that test. And then the numeric response questions, okay, those had different numbers in them. So I talked about how I went through and graded those last week. I talked about some of the things that I did to kind of give you points back based off of answers that you provided or the work that you submitted in addition to that test. If you are interested in taking a retest, okay, that's going to be anytime this week. So what you need to do for that would be to email me, like if you're interested in this, email me with the day and the time that you plan on taking that retest. Okay, so this will be on your own. You could be in school, you could be at home. If you're in school, I mean any location really, you could go to the testing center, but you do not have to. Okay, this is going to be on your own. Same resources available: open book, open note, calculator, GeoGebra, whatever. Our academic integrity policy still is in effect, though. Right? You cannot be contacting other people while taking the test or about the test, that sort of thing. When you send me that day and time, I will make the test available to you at that time. Okay? You log in. It will be the same test, but you'll be given different questions because of how it's randomly assigned. Now, there might be some questions that you do get the same question, okay? But all in all, you'll be getting a different batch of questions. Okay? Same things that you have available to you to practice and prepare for the retest. Okay? Those Canvas practice quizzes that I had created, especially the ones to prepare you for that numeric response. We have those study guides that were available as well. Okay, so you can go back and look at those to help you prepare. And obviously, any time that you have this week that you want to ask me questions or go over your test, you're welcome to do that. Right, I will take the higher of the 2 scores, but really, if you're prepared better for this test this time, there's no reason why you should do worse than that score, than that test beforehand. Any general questions about that? Okay, so keep in mind, that's if you want to, should be done this week, and notify me when you plan on taking that test. All right, so with this, we're picking up talking about those things to avoid, those pitfalls when asking questions, okay? How this might impact the results that you get with your survey. We started to talk a little bit about these first 2 last Wednesday when we met remotely: deliberate bias and unintentional bias. So we'll talk about them again and then spend more time with these other items. Remember, a deliberate bias is when you have questions worded so that they are deliberately supporting a type of response. Oftentimes you see these key words here: do you agree? Do you agree? If you really want the opinions of those who you are asking these questions, why are you trying to pull them to your side of the argument? Okay? You're just kind of inflating your own biased view. Okay? Do you agree that this should happen? Do you agree that this should happen? Okay? Or some other phrase to that effect. Right then and there, that's a red flag that is a biased question. It is deliberately biased. Okay? Appropriate wording should not indicate a desired answer. Now, an unintentional bias is not just like ignorant of, or that you are ignorant of a deliberate bias in the question. Our English language has a lot of words that have multiple meanings. And if you're not clear about the meaning that you intend in your question, people can interpret that many different ways. Okay? You're given the example. Do you use drugs? Talking prescription drugs, illegal drugs, over-the-counter drugs. Okay? We don't know. Sometimes you might be able to infer from the context of the rest of the questions, but you're going to get a variety of responses there. What is the most important date in your life? You're talking calendar date, you're talking social engagements. Okay, this was my favorite date that I've ever been on. We don't know. Okay? The same word can have multiple meanings. You might get something like, do you exercise? Well, exercise can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Are we talking about a 15-minute walk around the neighborhood, or are we talking about like an hour and a half up in the weight room, sweat pouring off of you? Well, whatever you intend. Okay, make it clear. Maybe you give those examples in your question. Okay, that exercise could include any of the following. Okay, or maybe you don't want the walk included. Okay, maybe you want something more deliberate. Okay, well, let that be known. Desire to please. Most respondents have a desire to please the person who is asking the question. Now, let's be honest, a lot of times this is true simply because the person wants this survey to be over. Right? They're being interviewed, they don't really like it, especially if this is a face-to-face kind of survey. You just want to get through it and get done. So a lot of times they'll answer questions just kind of to go along with it. But also with survey questions, like people tend to understate responses about undesirable social habits and vice versa. If you were to look at sales statistics for cigarettes and compare that with survey data based off of people being asked, do you smoke cigarettes or not? Those don't really correspond with each other, because the sales figures are what they are, right? That's what has been sold. And from there, you can kind of determine about how many people smoke based off of that. But that doesn't compare with people who acknowledge or admit to smoking cigarettes in surveys, because it's an undesirable social habit. People don't answer honestly or truthfully in survey questions. And there's this desire to please, or they might be a little bit embarrassed about it. Same kind of thing with like, have you visited the dentist in the last 6 months? And the human mind does something called like telescoping, where you think that, well, maybe it was 8 months ago that I was at the dentist, but the general tone of the question is about visiting the dentist in 6 months, 8 months. Yes, it's the same thing. Yes, I have been to the dentist. And you answer it that way, but there's a reason that 6 months was imposed as the timeline in that question. Okay, so sometimes you'll get more responses than is actually what has happened. It's very difficult to get honesty and truth in the surveys sometimes. Asking the uninformed. People do not like to admit that they don't know what you're talking about. Okay? There's an example here that when the American Jewish Committee studied Americans' attitudes towards various ethnic groups, this was in the early 90s, almost 30% of the respondents had an opinion about the fictional Ch8. Okay? There is no such group of people called the Ch8. Okay? But they didn't want to appear ignorant on this topic, so they said, yeah, I've heard of the Ch8. 30%. It's almost 1 out of 3 people. Now, you could argue that they're put into a bad position because you're asking them about this fictitious group of people. But people don't want to appear ignorant. They don't want to appear stupid. Now, it's also important that when you're asking a question like this that might be complex and people might not know the answer, they might not have an opinion, it's important that they are able to respond like that in a comfortable way. So if you're asking this as a closed question, make sure you include options for, I don't know, or I have no opinion. Because that's just as important as giving an answer that is like affirmative or negative or whatever. Okay, think of that with like election polling. If you were a pollster and you're asking people who do you plan on voting for in the upcoming election, and you just gave them options of Donald Trump or Joe Biden, those are the only 2 options, you're not going to get accurate data. Because what if you want to have people vote for a third party? Okay? What if people what if they're undecided? Okay? That you should still present options for alternative answers, or I don't know, or I have no opinion. Because otherwise, then you're forcing them to choose something that they probably don't actually believe. And your goal is to get truthful and honest data, at least as best as possible. Now, I talked about like making up this group of people here, and there's kind of like a subcategory of that, asking the uninformed. People like to mess with you sometimes. And that's even more so true when you're surveying like high school teenagers and stuff like that, which we will be doing a little bit of. Okay, when asked in a survey, 1 in 5 people admitted taking Durbasol, a made-up drug that doesn't exist. Well, in the first place, you're asking about some made-up drug, so you kind of have it coming. But secondly, 1 in 5 people, 20% of those asked, say that, yes, I take this. So they either don't know what sort of prescription drugs they're taking, or they're just messing with you. Yeah, yes, I do this. Yes, I do this. Yes, I saw a ghost last night. Yes, like, they'll just respond any which way. Okay? Especially if you get like ridiculously long surveys that are overly complicated. Okay? Keep it short, keep it concise, keep it to the point, and keep it honest. Okay? Use proper judgment when surveying. Because other times you might get responses to something like this if you have unnecessary complexity. And you kind of follow that old KISS acronym. Keep it simple, stupid. If questions are to be understood, they must be kept simple. For example here, shouldn't former drug dealers not be allowed to work in hospitals after they are released from prison? Wait, what? It's like a double negative going on here. Shouldn't former drug dealers not be allowed to work in hospitals after? Like, you almost have to think about what is being asked even before you can determine how you feel about that. That should not be your focus, or that should not be the respondent's focus when answering a survey question. Okay? Clean this up. There's got to be a better way to ask this question so that the respondent can just focus on how they feel. Another one here. Asking more than one question at a time. Do you support the president's health care plan because it would ensure that all Americans receive health coverage? Well, what if you feel like one way, but not for that reason? What if you say no, but you do think all Americans should receive health coverage? Or what if you say yes, but not for this reason? How are you supposed to respond to that type of question? Okay? Do not ask more than one question at the same time. Now, don't confuse that. That's part of unnecessary complexity with the ordering of questions. Okay? Questions shouldn't influence responses on other questions. For example, to what extent do you think teenagers today worry about peer pressure related to drinking alcohol? Next question, name the top 5 pressures you think face teenagers today. Well, I can pretty much guarantee that peer pressure related to drinking alcohol is going to be on that list because it's been triggered by the previous question. Okay, if you need to have both of these questions on this survey, put that top 5 question earlier in the survey and this other one later on when you're suggesting specific items that might be used on that survey. All right, the last thing to worry about when asking questions, confidentiality and anonymity. Sometimes these two words are used interchangeably when they have distinct, separate meanings. If something is confidential, the researcher promises not to release identifying information about the respondents. Okay, so the researcher has that, but he or she's keeping it private. If something is anonymous, the researcher does not know the identity of the respondents. So instead it's subject A, subject B, and so forth. Now, especially when you are talking about sensitive information, things about personal habits, people answer differently based on the degree to which they can remain anonymous. Now, think about this in terms of, like, if you were to perform a face-to-face survey, especially in this school environment. Like, you probably don't know every single person in this school, but a lot of people you do know. And if you're doing like a randomized survey, right, really the best you could do would be to promise to keep results confidential. Okay, where you know some of these individuals at least, but you're promising not to release any identifying information about them. To remain anonymous, that's kind of hard to do in a face-to-face setting when you know some of these people. Now, if you're doing like an online survey like Google Forms, there's an option there that you can track it to their email address. So that would not be anonymous if it's being traced based off of who responds, but it doesn't have to be like that. You could keep it confidential if you wanted to do it like that. Okay? But anonymity is probably the best way to go. Because think of it this way, like I mentioned last week that you don't really care about the sample, you care about the population. How well does this sample represent what's going on in the population? Well, even more so, you don't care about the individual. You care about the big picture. That is the purpose of surveying. Okay? You don't care about how this person, or this person, or this person. You care about all of these people together and how they represent that population that you're trying to describe. So if it takes confidentiality or it takes anonymity to help you get the most truthful and honest responses as possible, then you need to do what you can to ensure that. There's this point here that surveys on issues like sexual behavior and income are hard to conduct accurately because it's difficult. People don't want to necessarily believe that you're going to remain confident or anonymous, or that the confidentiality will be upheld. And very sensitive information, people are reluctant to respond, and you get a low response rate. Not that we're going to be surveying on that sort of thing, but you get what I'm saying. All right, the last big thing, the impact of technology. It's difficult, it's challenging, it's expensive to do personal interviews, especially on a large scale. Okay? So a lot more we're relying on technology to help perform and conduct surveys. Now, we've talked a little bit about random digit dialing. Okay, it's grown decreasingly useful as the proportion of homes with no landline has increased. Now, this is based off of some old laws where cell phones were not allowed to be in the database for random digit dialing. Okay, now that's based off of because pretty much everybody has unlimited calling in minutes for their phones now, their cell phones. But that wasn't always the case, where you would be charged per minute when you're making a call, but also when receiving a call on your cell phone. So most states passed laws that prohibited banks of random digits from call centers from calling cell phone exchanges, because they shouldn't be called and billed for these purposes, was their thinking. Now, the number of landlines has dramatically decreased over the last 10 years. And some states have removed those laws about the random digit dialing and being able to call cell phones, but there's no broad overlook for how that works. This was one of the issues that seeped into the polls leading up to the 2016 election. And that's something that I said we're going to read more about in our article on Wednesday. And internet surveys are used more and more frequently, but they can be difficult to do well as well. Okay, sometimes you get into this idea where you have a lot of people that you could reach, but to get accurate information from them and to actually get them to participate is something else. Let's consider in this setting, if we were to, it's feasible for us to have access to every student email in this building. Now, if I'm creating a survey, is it in my best interest to just mass email the entire student body? Probably not, especially if we're doing an assignment where many different people are also emailing different surveys. Okay? You open up your email and you have 30 different surveys to respond to. This starts to become like a voluntary response, where if people respond to any surveys, they might just be the ones that interest them. Okay? And the people with the strong opinions are the only ones to respond to that. Okay? It's difficult to do a well-designed online survey that's engaging, that's accurate, that makes people want to complete them, and it's representative of a larger population. Okay, so we'll be talking a little bit more about this, but don't just think that technology is kind of like curing everything for us. Any questions on that? Okay, so last thing, I forgot my little case study here. So you may have seen this photograph before. 1948 election, Harry Truman holding up a misprinted newspaper saying Dewey defeats Truman, because leading up to that election, some of the polls were indicating and the results were coming in that Harry Truman was going to lose. Okay, so he's holding up this headline from the Chicago Daily Tribune saying that he just lost the election that he actually won. Now, the reason why the pollsters got this wrong is they were using an outdated sampling method called quota sampling. Now, this seems like a good method on the surface. Okay? And I've noticed that sometimes students want to use methods along these lines. The way this works is that professional interviewers met assigned quotas to try to model the population as a whole. And this is based off of demographic information. So for example, they might be assigned to interview 10 white men under the age of 40, 5 African American men under 40, etc. But the problem here is, where do you stop? Okay, what are the important quotas to identify for a survey like this? Okay, you can overanalyze many different things and divide them into certain categories. Like here we're talking about age and race, community, socioeconomic status, level of education. Aren't those important too? Should we go after those quotas instead, or all of these quotas? Like, how do you fulfill your sample? Okay. Where do we stop? There's still a human element of who is chosen for that sample. Okay. We said that we're putting a lot of faith into the randomization. That mathematically, based off the rules of probability, the randomization should take care of it. It should balance it out across the big picture. That's why it's so important that your sample size is large enough. Because you're putting so much faith in the randomization. Even with carefully laid plans, human intervention in choosing the sample is always subject to bias. Okay? So as you get more and more quotas that you need to fulfill, you're not doing it randomly. You're trying to identify certain participants based off of demographic information. That's not as random as it could or should be. The article on Wednesday that you're going to read talks about something similar, but it's not quota sampling in the case where you're targeting certain types of individuals because you want them to represent your population. Okay? Again, this is like well-intentioned. You're trying to do the right thing. But in that process, extra bias is seeping in. Okay? It's talking about in 2016 how level of education turned out to be an important demographic in determining accuracy of the polls. And instead of quota sampling like this, they've now started to weight the different respondents. Those with a higher level of education are more likely to respond to the polls. So they need to keep that in consideration when they are issuing these polling results. So they've started to weight those different values. Is that good or is that bad? Well, I guess it all depends on how accurate that is. Yeah, so we're going to read a little bit about that on Wednesday. All right, quick overview of our sampling methods. Yeah, we've got the good and the bad. On Thursday, we'll be looking at a little activity where we can see how these sampling methods work based off a little exercise that we're going to be doing. So, quick review here. A simple random sample. Everyone in that population has an equally likely chance of being selected for the sample. This could be as easy as all the names in a hat, mix it up, and you pick however many you need. Because everybody in the population is in that hat. Typically, though, we're using a random number generator along with that sampling frame, the list of everyone in the population, to help us pick this sample. Okay? Now, it's simple in its design. it's very difficult to implement, especially across a large scale, a large population, because you need that sampling frame. You need that list of everyone in the population. Sometimes that's not in existence. It's not practical to get something like that. So instead, we look at other methods. Stratified is the first one that we talked about, our first alternative. In stratified sampling, you're splitting the population into different groups called strata, and then you're performing a simple random sample within each of those strata. Now, typically those strata have an identifying characteristic for which is relevant to that survey. A lot of times stratified samples are done based off of geographic region. Okay, so if I'm looking at the state of Pennsylvania, I could stratify by urban, suburban, and rural communities. And then from there, if I had a sampling frame, I could simple random sample from within those three regions. Or I could stratify again. And maybe stratify down into county or community, and keep going until I can obtain that sampling frame to perform the simple random sample. Cluster sampling is also splitting the population into groups. This time, these clusters, they typically do not have important identifying characteristics. Instead, they're pretty much just all sets of people. And the big difference between cluster and stratified is that in cluster sampling, you're taking a simple random sample of clusters. While with stratified, you're taking a simple random sample within each strata, within each group. And cluster is a random sample of groups. Remember, I gave you the example of the dorm rooms and the different levels in each dorm. We had 180 total floors in these dorms on a college campus. So I numbered these floors 1 through 180. I took a random sample of 5 floors. And then I pursued everyone on those selected floors to participate in my survey. That's cluster sampling. The big perk of cluster sampling is that you do not need a sampling frame. Systematic sampling, you're following a process or a system to obtain your sample. Now, you do need a frame for this. You do need a list of everyone in the population. In this case, you have like a step size that works your way through. Okay? So if you have your population in front of you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're in my sample. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're in my sample. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth, until you get your sufficient sample size. Now, potential problems for a systematic sample would be if your step size doesn't get you through the entire population, there could be bias with that. Especially if your sampling frame, your list of the population, is like an alphabetized directory. Right? If your step size doesn't get you out of the A's or B's, maybe the way this list is composed, that has some bias involved. Okay? You're not getting down towards the bottom of the alphabet. Okay? Or maybe if we were to use a systematic sample with the high school student population, and that list is organized by class or grade level, again, if you're not careful, you might not get out of like the freshman class or the freshman and sophomore class, and that's not going to be representative of the entire population. Multi-stage sample, and we talked a little bit about that with stratified, where you might do it over and over again a couple times to get it down to a more manageable level. You might also incorporate other techniques, stratify a couple times and then go with cluster. You might also like break the population into different groups or regions and and then employ different surveying techniques within those groups. Okay? And not exactly a stratified or cluster, okay, but showing hints of those. Those are the good methods. Here we have the bad and the ugly. And remember, convenient samples. The rule of thumb is the easier it is for you to obtain your sample, the less reliable those results are. The greater the possibility of bias. If you were to try to get opinions about students in this school and you stood outside the door early in the morning as students were coming into the building, that's a convenient sample, right? You're letting the people come to you. Now, that could be biased because, well, you get a lot of people coming in early. Maybe those opinions differ from the people who are coming in last minute late. Or you get this bus that's dropping off a whole group of students, and you start surveying each of those students on that bus because they're the first ones to come through, and that fulfills your desired sample size, and you, oh, this is all I need, I'm done. Students on that bus are all from the same neighborhood. Maybe their opinions are not representative of everyone across the entire township. Okay, I'm not saying that it's automatically bad, it's just based off of the nature of your questions, there is a greater increased chance of bias in those responses. Lastly, a voluntary response. Okay, voluntary response is basically worthless. These are the kinds of things where we said that people log in to take your poll, okay, or different media sites or media organizations will have their little quick questions and want people to respond to them. A voluntary response, you get people whose opinions, they feel very strongly about them. They are the ones taking time out of their day to go and answer these questions. I had a good question in one of my earlier classes about like those surveys that you get on like the bottom of a receipt or something when you're at a restaurant or wherever, like win a $500 gift card if you participate in this survey. This person was asking, like, is that a convenience sample or is that a voluntary response? And my answer was, it's not ideal, but they're probably getting a more representative array of responses than they would if it was just the people who called in who complained, right? If they're not offering some sort of incentive, a chance to win a gift card or 10% off your next order or something like that, when you offer that incentive, you're encouraging people who have a good experience to call in or to log in and fill out this survey and share those good experiences, that customer feedback. Otherwise, the only people calling in are the ones who want to complain about something. And if you're just getting the complaints, as deflating as that is as a business owner or whatever, it's also not representative of the true customer experience. So it's certainly voluntary response, but offering an incentive like that might actually make it a little bit more representative than it otherwise would be. Any questions on any of these? All right. So we do have a Chapter 8 homework assignment that you have some time, good amount of time, to get started on that right now. That will be due at the beginning of the day on Wednesday. So 8:05, beginning of our remote day. All right. Those of you in the building today, we have books over here and paper if you want to borrow either of those. Those of you at home, I would like you to remain logged in, but you can work with your camera off. Okay? And as always, I'm here if you have questions, so please contact me. Also, if you're thinking about that retest, make sure that you email me with your day and your time. And also let me know if you have questions as you're reviewing and preparing.